This hearing is now back in session. At this time, we will hear testimony from Mr. Patrick Lahey, co-founder and CEO of Triton Submarines. Mr. Lahey, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Sir, Lieutenant Steele will now administer the oath.
Okay.
Please stand and raise your right hand. A false statement given to an agency of the United States is punishable by fine and/or imprisonment under 18 USC 1001. Knowing this, do you solemnly swear that the information you're about to provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Mr. Lahey, Lieutenant Commander Tom Whalen is going to start the questioning today.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Lahey. All of my questions are going to be related to your background, Triton Submersibles, and your interactions that you had personally with OceanGate and Mr. Rush. Again, thank you for being here. And as we ask you questions throughout your interview, if you need to take a break, just please let us know.
Okay.
Before you,
Mr. Whalen, I think for the record, just want to make sure it's Triton Submarines. Is that correct?
Okay. Triton Submarines, yes.
You had mentioned Triton Submersibles. Just want to...
Roger. Yes, sir. Before we begin, I'll ask you to please refrain from using any acronyms. If you should use an acronym, I will stop you to explain so you can explain what that acronym is.
Okay, will do.
Can you start off by briefly explaining how you began to focus on designing and building submersibles?
Okay, well, I can give you a short answer or a long answer, but I'll try to make it concise. I began my underwater career, my diving career in about 1981, 1982. I began work as a commercial diver, and I was lucky enough in the early part of my career to work for a commercial diving company by the name of IUC, International Underwater Contractors. They're based out of New York, but they had opened an office in Santa Barbara, California. They had a number of human-occupied vehicles or submersibles, and because I had demonstrated abilities to fix and solve problems, they asked if I'd like to learn how to operate a sub. I piloted my first sub when I was 21. That was 41 years ago, and I was so thrilled by the experience, and it left such an indelible impression on me that I knew from that point on I wanted to devote my life to these incredible machines. So I worked with subs in all kinds of different capacities. I worked with them in oil and gas. I worked with them in tourism, in filming, in science, salvage, and in 2006, I started a company called Triton Submarines with my partner, Bruce Jones at the time. And we decided we were going to we had actually been trying to promote the idea of subs on people's private yachts for about 10 years before that, but we didn't get much traction. You know, there's tremendous resistance or skepticism surrounding human-occupied vehicles or submersibles. And that's actually one of the things I'm here to try and hopefully address. I think people's perception, by and large, is that subs are dangerous and scary and complicated, and that only crazy people get in them. But I can assure you that they're anything but. They're magnificent machines, and they allow people to visit a part of our world they couldn't see any other way and to do it safely. So we embarked on this crusade of trying to promote the idea of subs on yachts beginning in about '94. We found our first customer in 2006, a gentleman by the name of Chris Klein, and we built him a little two-person sub that could dive to 1,000 feet that he put on the back of his motor yacht called Mind Games. And that really got the conversation started. People started to pay attention. Rather than me telling them that owning a sub would be a great idea and how much fun it would be and how exciting it would be to go and visit these parts of the earth you couldn't visit any other way, we now had somebody who was a peer of theirs saying how wonderful it was to have a sub and speaking, excitedly about the extraordinary experiences he was having in the sub we had built for them. That really started the ball rolling, and subsequent to that, we've sold, I think 30 subs. We've got 4 or 5 under construction right now. Triton builds subs that dive as shallow as 100 meters, or as deep as, which is 330 feet, or dive as deep as 11,000 meters, 36,000 feet. In fact, Triton built the deepest diving sub in the world. I'm very proud of that fact. And right now, the company employs about 53, 54 people. We have 35 in Vero Beach, in Sebastian. We moved to Sebastian. And we have 19 people in Barcelona, Spain.
Sir, what's the difference between a submersible and a submarine?
It's a very good question. And often people don't recognize the difference. But a submersible is a craft that is not capable of regenerating its own power. A submarine has to have the capacity to regenerate its own energy supply. And so the thing about a submersible is it's usually powered by batteries or some sort of an energy source that's limited and limits its endurance. So you're not going to get in a submersible and cross an ocean or transit a great distance. They're not really built for that purpose. Submersibles are built to explore a smaller area, imagine like a neighborhood or whatever. And the idea is that it will allow you to generally go much deeper than a submarine, because typically military submarines are quite limited in their diving depth, whereas we build vehicles that go extremely deep. And they allow you to get into a part of the world that we've really spent very little time exploring. That's the thing, I suppose, that I find most exciting about them.
Do you have or have you ever held a merchant mariner credential?
A merchant?
A merchant mariner credential? A MMLD or merchant mariner license?
No, I have not.
So you've never been licensed by United States Coast Guard?
Oh, yes, I did have a 100-ton ocean operator license. And actually, I was one of 7 U.S. Coast Guard licensed submarine pilots or submersible pilots. We set up an operation when I worked for Atlantis Submarines in 1987. It was the first tourist submarine operating in U.S. waters that were controlled by the Coast Guard. And we worked directly with the Coast Guard to get their approval and involvement in the operation of that sub.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that process specific to you?
Well, it was an interesting process because it was all brand new. There were no rules governing the safe use of a human-occupied vehicle that's carrying passengers for hire. And so we worked closely with the Coast Guard to help establish those rules. And I think it resulted in the publication of a thing called the NAVIC 593, I think it was, as I recall. Amazing that I actually remember that. And that really sort of spelled out what the rules would be for a sub that was carrying passengers for hire in U.S. waters that were under Coast Guard jurisdiction.
And just for the record, NAVIC stands for Naval Vessel Inspection Circular.
Okay.
Correction for the record.
There you
It's
go.
Right,
Navigation and
sorry.
Vessel Inspection
There you
Circular.
go. Well, that's an acronym you guys would know better than I do. So
Now, was that, so you had achieved that endorsement on your license for Atlantis Submersibles. As you know, what is the difference between a passenger submersible and do you create passenger submersibles?
we do. I mean, any of our subs, I suppose, can be used to carry passengers. Typically, you know, I'm not even sure that you would distinguish them as passengers versus paying passengers. They're people, and as such, you know, the requirements, you know, for carrying people are the same. Having said that, you know, I think typically a passenger carrying submarine would carry more people because, of course, the point of it is to generate revenue. And yes, we do build tourist submarines or passenger carrying submarines. We recently delivered a submarine that carries 24 people and dives to 100 meters or 330 feet. It's called the Deep View 24. It's a modular design where you could make it as little as 12 people all the way up to 66 people. And that sub is operating in Vietnam right now. We also recently delivered a sub, you could call it a tourist submarine, but it carries 9 people, pilot and 8 guests, and it operates off of a cruise ship.
And are those built to a different standard?
No, they are not.
If you were to build one to a United States or a U.S. flag passenger vessel, would it be built to a separate standard or a Coast Guard standard?
I'm sure there would be additional requirements that we'd have to comply with. Of course, the certification that we base all of our vehicles on, you know, is usually one of 2 certification agencies that we work with, the American Bureau of Shipping and what used to be Det Norske Veritas Germanischer Lloyd, but what is now DNV, because DNV acquired GL. And those certification agencies have had rules governing submersible craft or human-occupied vehicles for over 50 years. And they've evolved over time as those vehicles have evolved. That's the sort of primary, the sort of backbone certification that our vehicles have. But there's additional requirements too that we apply. Believe it or not, there's also a Cayman Islands flag registry that we often have to comply with. And that's because many of the yachts that our subs go on are flagged in Cayman. And so we have to comply with their rules. And if the sub is going to be operating in U.S. waters, then of course, especially if it's going to be carrying passengers for hire, then I'm certain we would also have to comply with U.S. Coast Guard rules. So far, we haven't, I think, other than maybe the scenic vessel will be operating in Alaska at some point, and it may, and certainly would get Coast Guard involvement at that time.
Sir, in your opinion, what specifically sets Triton Submersibles apart from other deep-sea exploration vehicles in the market?
Of course, I would say because we build the deepest diving, most capable subs that are out there, but there are other players in the same space that adhere to the same rules that we do. We are entirely focused on safety and certification. No Triton sub would ever be built or delivered that wasn't certified, and that even includes our deepest diving sub. So when we were commissioned by a client to build a sub that could dive to 11,000 meters or 36,000 feet, I insisted that the sub was certified. And that made the project more difficult, more challenging, more time-consuming, and more expensive. But ultimately, I would point to that certification as the primary reason that sub is diving regularly to the deepest places in the ocean. In fact, that sub has made 19 dives to full ocean depth, which is unprecedented. And I've had the privilege of making 5 of those dives. The sub also has made 150 dives beyond 6,000 meters. And I think it's made almost 400 dives now between 4,000 and 6,000 meters. So certification matters because it's about building something that's robust, durable, reliable, something that people can dive in with confidence, knowing that it meets an internationally recognized set of standards.
And what are the key critical safety features of your vessels? What components do you see as the key critical safety features?
Well, there are so many because, of course, the entire vehicle has multiple layers of redundancy in virtually every area. So whether it's life support or it's ballast systems or communications, tracking, navigation, there's redundancies built in because you have to assume that if there's a single system failure, that it doesn't result in the vehicle being in a perilous situation, and that your capacity to sustain life is not affected, for example, by the lack of power. So, for example, you lost all power in the vehicle, that does not prevent you from being able to bring the submarine back to the surface or to be able to maintain a safe, breathable atmosphere inside the craft.
And you had mentioned classification societies. How important is a classification society in the manufacturing and certification process of a submersible?
Well, it's foundational. It's fundamental. It's essential. To me, I think any machine that's going to be carrying human beings into the deep sea has to meet the high bar of certification by an independent third-party classification society. I don't believe that it's negotiable. I don't believe that we should be operating experimental vehicles in the deep sea.
Have you ever delivered an operational submersible that was not inspected or classed by a classification society?
No, I have not. And nor would I.
So I want to talk a little bit about the pressure hull, or the pressure vessel for human occupancy portion of the submersibles. Can you talk about the importance of the pressure hull and how that is tested and created with Triton submersibles?
Sure. Well, the certification of a pressure hull actually begins at inception. As as the engineers are busy doing calculations and analysis, and they're creating design, all of that stuff has to be reviewed and approved before anything is actually made. Then we have to select materials. Those materials have to come from a known source, and that source has to be an approved source of material supply. And once we do get that material, coupons of that material are removed and tested independently to verify the characteristics of that material, so that, in fact, you don't just take a certificate from a manufacturer as evidence of its characteristics. You actually have to prove that it has those physical characteristics. Then the material is made into a shape, whatever that shape might be, and then the other parts are added to it. The whole thing is tested. In our case, it's usually 1.25 times its maximum allowable working pressure or maximum diving depth. And in the case of a new vehicle, those designs are usually strain gauged so that you have data that supports that initial analysis and substantiates that your initial assumptions about the design were in fact true, and they bear out through the actual readings that you get from the sensors that are in the craft when it's being tested. And then, of course, because this boundary is the thing that protects human beings, it's only part of a system. So you have the pressure boundary, which obviously is the thing that protects the people from the crushing pressure, but then you have all the other systems. So any pressure boundary other than the pressure hull also has to go through that same testing regimen, whether it's a battery pod, a ballast tank, or a housing for a motor or a pump. Everything has to be tested to 1.25 times its diving depth.
Can you walk me through the testing procedure? So you've mentioned tested. Are they manned tests, unmanned tests?
No, they're tested in a chamber without people. And the chamber we use chambers all over the world. We even have the deepest rated chambers in Europe are in our facility in Barcelona, Spain. We do a lot of our own testing, but we do it in the presence of a surveyor. So the surveyor actually comes and witnesses these tests and substantiates that you've followed a test procedure. So a test procedure is always written for whatever assembly it is that's being tested, and then they verify that you follow that procedure, and then the results of that become a permanent record, permanent part of the submarines or the submersibles documentation set. So walking you through the test, what they try to do is simulate what a dive might look like. For example, if you're building a sub that dives to 1,000 meters, as I said, it would be tested to 1,250 meters. So instead of being tested to 3,300 feet, it would be tested to, 1,250 meters. It's like 4,100 feet or something like that. I don't have the calculation in my head, but you guys can do the math, I'm sure. And you try to simulate a pressure cycle that simulates how long it would take the vehicle to reach its targeted depth. And then you have a period where you're sustaining that pressure at depth, and you make sure that there's no creep on any of the instrumentation. In other words, that the hull isn't changing in its characteristics, and then you bring it back to the surface. Usually there's multiple cycles that would be required as part of that certification. And what you want to prove, again, is your initial assumptions. So today, we're very lucky. We live in a very exciting time. There are analytical tools and software that engineers can use where they can predict the performance of a pressure boundary with incredible accuracy. Give you an example. We tested our full ocean depth sub in Russia, the only test chamber in the world that could actually conduct that test. This was before, this is when we were allowed to go and use that test facility, which we can't today. And when we brought it to its full diving depth, plus I think it was 20% in that case, we predicted there would be a 28-liter, what do you call that? We have a graduated cylinder that measures the compression of the hull, and we predicted it would be 28 liters, and it was exactly 28 liters. And then we do repeated cycles to make sure that water all goes back in, and then when it comes back out, that kind of thing. So it's all part of verifying that through testing, your assumptions, your analysis, your calculations were correct, and that the machine that you've created is behaving exactly as you expected it to and as you predicted it would.
And so is all this testing done solely with Triton subs, or is it done in conjunction with other classification societies?
No, it's done hand in hand with the classification society. So they're present when this testing is done. They participate in it, and they actually We'll submit a procedure for the testing that we're going to do. They'll review it. They'll make changes to it if they feel those changes are warranted. And then ultimately you arrive at a procedure that everybody's agreed on. That includes everything from where the instrumentation is going to be put, to how many cycles are used, to what sort of pressurization rate, how much dwell time you spend on the bottom, all of that. And then once that's been approved by the Classification Society, they send a surveyor out to witness it as it's being implemented.
Have you ever attempted to classify a new or a novel submersible structure with class?
Well, yeah, I would say that we're constantly building new sub-designs. We're always challenging conventional thinking, trying to innovate, but we're doing that within the confines of the Classification Society rules. I'm a firm believer in innovation. I think innovation is a critical part of progress, forward progress. But innovation has to be done within the crucible of a set of rules that give you guardrails. You can't just go freestyle.
And in your experience working with the class surveyors, they've been amenable to change and innovation as long as it's within their construct?
Yeah, absolutely. Not only are they amenable to innovation, they participate in that innovation. They have tools and people who have capabilities better than we do. So their contribution to the certification of a novel design, of a new vehicle, a new design, is an essential part of our capacity to actually achieve the objective of building a new design. They contribute meaningfully to our capacity to do that.
So as the Classification Society, do they only take part for the initial certification, or is there testing or interval testing over the years that they take part in as well?
No, certification is a process that never ends. It begins at inception with those initial design analysis and so on, and follows through to the time the vessel is completed and delivered, and then it continues through the lifetime of that vehicle with annual renewals and special periodic renewals that, depending on the Classification Society, can be as little as 3 years or as many as 5 years. But there are specific requirements that have to be completed every year. Well, there's weekly, there's monthly, there's quarterly, there's annual, and there's special periodical requirements that we have to fulfill. You have to keep records. Logs have to be maintained, charge logs, maintenance logs, dive logs, comm logs. The idea is that you are operating and maintaining a craft in accordance with our rules as a manufacturer and the rules of the Classification Society.
So just so I understand, a lot of the submersibles that you design and build, you then sell to customers.
Yes.
And they're no longer your property, they're now owned by the customer. So at that point, is there an obligation for them to ensure that they maintain the classification standard?
Yes, if they don't continue to fulfill the requirements that we've outlined as the manufacturer and those of the Classification Society, then class will be canceled. And I'm very proud of the fact that every sub that we've delivered, even the ones we delivered 18 years ago or 17 years ago, they're all in class, they're all still rated to their original depth, and they're all still being used by people that we maintain a great relationship with. That relationship is very important, not just to the customer, but to me as a manufacturer, to us as a manufacturer. We want to make sure that that sub is being maintained appropriately, it's being operated responsibly, it's being kept in the condition that it needs to be in order to continue to be used safely.
And you had just mentioned being operated safely. Can you explain how important is the human aspect of operation of a submersible?
Well, the human aspect of operating a sub is essential again. It's foundational. We don't deliver a sub to a customer that hasn't been properly trained. And our training isn't just teaching somebody how to make it go up and down and backwards and forwards. That's the easy part. As part of our training, we teach a client how to operate and also maintain a craft. So we teach them how to do maintenance procedures. We show them how to take things apart, to rebuild things, put them back together, test things, and so on. And while, as a client's experience level increases and their dependency on us is diminished, because that's to be expected. Once a client becomes more familiar with the vehicle, once they become more experienced with it, their capacity to do much of this work by themselves increases. It's still, of course, being done with the oversight of the Classification Society. They don't just get to do it on their own. But our direct involvement is oftentimes reduced, but we typically still are supplying them with equipment. We're still being consulted when they want to make modifications, when they want to add new equipment, if they want to make an upgrade. And sometimes as well, we get involved in their actual surveys, the annual surveys, the special periodical surveys. Oftentimes as well, those subs are returned to our facility, and we actually undertake that work together with their personnel.
Once they complete the Triton Submersible Pilot Training Program, do they receive a certification to become a Triton Submersible pilot?
They do, but they also have to demonstrate their capabilities to the satisfaction of the attending surveyor. So they don't just take our word for it. Ultimately, the final arbiter of whether an operation is considered safe and the people that are responsible for using the equipment are appropriately trained and experienced, that also falls to the certification agency.
Does any part of the training include emergency procedures?
Of course, emergency procedures are an inherent part of the safe operation of a submersible, and as part of any training, they would be taught how to conduct emergency procedures of every kind. Yeah.
In your experience, how important do you believe it is to have a rescue submersible or an ROV readily available at a dive site?
Well, I think having a rescue asset is an important part of a safe operation. Of course, a lot of rescue capabilities will depend on the operational area. Are you operating in a remote site where there's absolutely nobody nearby that might have rescue assets available? So when we look at diving in a new place, we create two plans. We create a self-help plan and an outside help plan. And the self-help plan is just, what do you have on hand, in terms of rescue capabilities? Do you have an ROV? Is there a second sub? Many of our clients have two subs. So you've got your second sub, then you've got your built-in safety system. Some people have an ROV on board. So that would be your self-help plan. And if you're diving shallow, you might even look at what local diving resources there are. Are there technical divers in the area? So obviously, if you're diving to 100 meters, that's starkly different than diving to 11,000 meters or 4,000 meters or 2,000 meters. Anyway, and then the outside help plan, what you do is you take a look at local and regional assets that might be called upon in the event of an emergency. You identify what those assets are. You notify them that you're going to be diving in a given area, and you request their commitment to assist you should such assistance become necessary. And so that's a standard practice, that our clients will observe, and we help them with that, because oftentimes we'll have multiple clients in a given area, and that makes it easier. So if you've got 3 or 4 clients diving in the Bahamas, there's sort of a standard practice that this, I'm sure, is the same with you guys in at-sea operations on the surface. You would always pledge your willingness to assist a fellow mariner. And that applies to people who are diving underwater. So our customers, even if they're not directly in contact with one another, we will help them facilitate an outside help plan that ensures assets within the area could be called upon should they be needed. And so we will communicate that to one another, and then they have their plan. Sorry, a bit of a long-winded answer.
I want to talk about a few of the submersible systems. Can you talk about the drop weight systems that you employ with Triton Submersibles?
Sure. So on our deeper diving subs, we'll use drop weights as standard, sort of a consumable. That would be in a sub that's probably diving deeper than or 4,000 meters and beyond. Shallower diving subs tend to use drop weights as emergency systems. So we have drop weights, we have jettisonable components, jettisonable arms, jettisonable battery pods, and so on, jettisonable weights. But they wouldn't be used as standard operation. They would strictly be used in the case that your primary, secondary, and maybe tertiary ballast systems were not working. So it's way down the line in terms of backup and redundancy. Like for example, a typical Triton sub will have 4 independent means of coming back to the surface. You got your main ballast tank system, you got your thrusters, you got a water ballast system, and then you have jettisonable weights that you can employ. And those jettisonable weights are usually powered by an independent battery if they're frangible bolts, or an independent hydraulic system that's manually operated and has no dependency on power. Again, to ensure that if you had a situation where you've lost power, it doesn't hinder your ability to bring the submarine back to the surface. And by the way, the main ballast tank system also doesn't have any dependency on power. So drop weights are typically only employed on very deep diving submarines where using conventional ballast systems is impractical because the energy required to run a pump, at 36,000 feet is so immense that you just simply, wouldn't do it.
So in the case with the Triton submersible, they had utilized drop weights to slow their descent through the water column. Is that something that is utilized normally in practice?
In a sub diving to 4,000 meters, having jettisonable weights as part of a ballasting system would not be unusual. There would typically be other systems as well, though, not just droppable weights. So, some type of a variable ballast system that probably in subs diving to that depth would typically be like pumping oil from a reservoir into a bladder to increase displacement.
What are the majority of Triton hulls made of, Triton pressure vessels made of?
The majority of our subs are made of a transparent material called polymethyl methacrylate, or acrylic. And one of the great things about acrylic is it's strong, it's malleable, but of course it's also transparent, so you can see through it. And it has another interesting characteristic, which is that it has the same refractive index as water. So when you submerge in a pressure boundary made of acrylic, it's almost like there's nothing between you and the environment that you're looking at. So it really makes the experience of being underwater very compelling and very immersive. And so that's the vast majority of our subs do feature acrylic pressure boundaries. However, when you start getting into deeper water, we look at other materials. We're currently developing, coincidentally, a 4,000 meter rated sub that has a transparent pressure hull made of acrylic. And again, this has never been done before. It's a novel design, if you will. But of course, we're working closely with DNV on the development of this very unique sub.
And what is the name of that submersible?
I think they're calling it, let me just think it's called the Triton 4 kilometer, because that's its diving depth, 2 AE Abyssal Explorer. But I think our client just calls it the Explorer sub. Interestingly, 4,000 meters is the sort of average depth of the ocean. So the idea behind being able to get to 4,000 meters, which is just over 13,000 feet, is it gives you access to, I think, around 55 or 60% of the seafloor.
And what's the maximum occupancy for that submersible?
Just 2 people.
And how far long is that in production?
We're expecting to deliver that sub in the spring of 2026. It's a time-consuming process, to design, engineer, build, and then test a machine like this. So it's done according to a timetable, but the timetable doesn't drive the program. The success of the development is what drives it. And, it should take about 2 more or 18 more months, but if it takes 20, then that's what it takes. It'll take whatever is required to make sure that it's right.
And for a submersible like the Abyssal Explorer, how many cycles to depth do you believe you'll get to in the testing phase?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can even answer it yet because it'll be mandated by the certification agency. I don't know how many they'll require, how many tests that they'll require, but we'll obviously submit to whatever they insist is necessary.
And you had mentioned gauges and monitors in the hull. Do you employ monitoring and gauging within your submersibles?
During the testing phase, but not when they're being operated. You know, there's no reason, if you've designed a pressure boundary appropriately, there's no reason to have instrumentation in it to monitor its health. The expectation is that you've designed something where the health of the pressure boundary is an inherent part of the design.
Commander Whelan, can I ask a follow-up to that? Of course. Sir, you said you could not have to monitor it real time, but that be under the conditions that it would be receiving some kind of annual testing or kind of maintenance monitoring over time?
Well, the maintenance monitoring, yes, that's baked in. It's a requirement to maintain class that you go through a series of checks annually, just like they do with an aircraft. You know, an aircraft goes through, you know, annual maintenance as well in order to renew its certification in much the same way that a submersible does, a classed and certified submersible does.
Thank you.
Sir, I'd like to turn to some questions with regards to OceanGate and Mr. Rush. When did you become aware of OceanGate?
Trying to think of exactly when, but certainly we were reading about their activities probably as far back as 2015, 2016. You know, interestingly, they actually bought a couple of subs that I was involved in building. You know, like you guys are referring to a sub as Cyclops 1, that sub was Lula. We built it in Devon in Tavistock in the UK, and at the time we built it, it was ABS classed, and it had a vegetable oil burning diesel engine in it, and you know, it was a classed vehicle. So they renamed it, and I don't know what happened to the certification, but certainly at one time that was a classed vehicle. The Antipodes, which is another craft that's owned and operated by OceanGate, was a sub that I was involved in developing. Again, an ABS classed sub. And at all times when we were involved with it, it was certified. I don't know what the condition of those subs is any longer, and nor do I know if they're still classed. I don't remember what your question was, but I just thought I'd get that in there.
It was when did you become aware of OceanGate?
It must have been around 2015 or something like that when we started hearing about some of the things they were doing. And I actually saw the craft in 2019, very briefly. I was on a sailing vacation with my family in the Abcos in the Bahamas, and I walked up to the bar, as you do, and I had a Triton t-shirt on, as I often do. And the team walked up to me and asked, you know, why I had the Triton shirt on, and told them that it was my company. They told me they had a sub in the Bahamas that they were testing and would I like to see it, to which I said yes. And they said the next day they would take me over and show me the vehicle. That was the one and only time that I saw the sub. That was in 2019. I think it was around March. It was just before, coincidentally, we went out and did our dives to 10,932 meters or 35,865 feet in a classed vehicle.
And when you went to go visit this submersible, what was your impression of the working environment?
Well, I mean, I didn't specifically expect or plan to see it. It was just coincidental. And so the next day they took me over and gave me a quick sort of tour of it. And, you know, I wasn't particularly impressed by what I saw, and I told them, you know, they were very nice people, and they seemed well-intentioned. I just said it looked to me like a lot of the stuff was not quite ready for prime time, and that there were many things in it that I thought had not been executed as appropriately as they should be. And there were a few things that I saw that concerned me, like they had these glass spheres that they were using as junction boxes, and I said, you can't have those on a human-occupied vehicle. And if you do, you need to fill them with liquid.
Do you remember what month it was in 2019 that you had?
I think it was in March 2019, because we went out to the Marianas Trench in April, so it was just before that.
Were you aware that the hull was a carbon fiber hull?
I was.
Have you ever built a submersible of a carbon fiber hull?
No, I have not.
Did
Now,
you ever?
interestingly, though, and it's worth mentioning because the idea of a filament wound pressure boundary is not a new idea, right? This idea that it was innovative or cutting edge. I was operating subs in the early 1980s that used filament wound cylinders as pressure boundaries. All the atmospheric diving suits, the ADS suits that I piloted in the early part of my career, had a filament wound cylinder. It was GRP, not carbon fiber, but glass reinforced plastic instead of carbon fiber. But it was still a filament wound cylinder. It had an aluminum piece on each end, tie rods that bolted the whole thing together, a hatch on one end and a window on the other end. And it was small. It was like the size of a sofa. You could sort of slide in it, and it was just for one person. And limited diving depth, 610 meters, about 2,000 feet. But they made 27. Last one I operated was number 27. I think they made about 30 of those. And they were all certified by Lloyd's Registry of Shipping because they were being built by a company in the UK. Naturally, they'd gravitate to their classification society in the UK. I heard years later they were taken out of service. I don't know why they were taken out of service and what prompted them to do that, but I made plenty of dives in them. But we, Triton, have never built anything with a filament wound cylinder or carbon fiber cylinder. We do use carbon fiber. We use it on fairings because it's a light, strong material, but we don't use it at anything where it's a structural boundary.
Have you ever had any conversations with Mr. Rush regarding his business plan or company vision?
Not really. I think I would bump into him occasionally at the conferences that we would attend. So there was a conference called, I think I'd remember, but I don't. And I would see him there. He knew I wasn't a huge fan of what they were doing. Again, I am unashamedly someone who believes that human-occupied vehicles should be certified and accredited. And despite the additional cost, time, trouble, expense, anguish, it's an essential deliverable as far as I'm concerned. So I'm just not a fan of people operating machines that aren't accredited and aren't certified. I think we need to have an independent peer review rather than us putting something together that we think is great. I think you need to have somebody look at it objectively and agree that it's great, and or tell you, where you might not have it right and where they may have ideas about how it could be made better or improved to ensure that ultimately the machine that people are going to dive in is safe.
Are you a part of the Marine Technology Society?
I am.
And were you aware of the letter dated March 27, 2018?
Yeah, I was a signatory on the letter.
Recorder, can you please bring up Exhibit 68? Is this the letter in which you were signatory? It's redacted at this time.
Yep, it is.
Was the letter ever delivered to Mr. Rush?
I assume so, yes.
Can you tell me about the letter and what the purpose of the letter was from the MTS?
Well, I think the letter was essentially to encourage him and his organization to take a step back and to look critically at the machine they were creating and to ensure that it was going to be safe for its intended purpose. And that's the advice I would give anybody. I just feel like it's important for us as manufacturers of machines that carry human beings into a dangerous environment that we're held to a standard, and that standard ensures that those machines are safe.
And to your knowledge, did this letter change any of the practices or procedures for OceanGate and Mr. Rush?
Sorry.
I would have no way of knowing that.
Mr. Lahey, OceanGate, please.
Yes, sure. I just wanted to point to the press release also from MTS regarding that letter, just to clarify in terms of its status.
And that status was that it was not
Well,
delivered?
I think it's the first page of that exhibit.
Can we go to the first page, please?
It's not,
Lieutenant Steele?
it's a separate exhibit.
Okay, it's Exhibit 96. I don't know if Mr. Lahey is aware of it, but it's dated, it's Exhibit 96, if you want to.
Okay. No, please stand by, sir. We'll call that up.
Sure.
Lieutenant Steele, can you do Exhibit 96?
I'll be able to bring that up after the break.
Okay. Let's see. Sir, we have actually been going for about 45 minutes. Can we take a short recess?
I'm okay, but if you guys would like to take a break, I'm not going to complain.
Okay. Yes, sir. We'll now take a short recess to get those exhibits back and reconvene at. Actually, we'll have to take a longer recess because we have to contact another witness over the break. So we'll reconvene at 2:10, if that's okay, sir.
Okay. Oh, 2:10, okay.
I have it, Mr. Newbauer.
You have the exhibit? Okay.
Okay.
Let's please keep going then, because I need to take a hard break at about 1:55. Okay. Lieutenant Steele, is this Exhibit 96?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, and well, is it okay if I ask Mr. Lahey about it now?
Yes, well, let's.
Sure, go ahead.
So were you, Mr. Lahey, were you still a member of the MTS this is from a year ago, I believe?
I'm not familiar with this letter, and I don't believe I was a signatory on it. I'm not familiar with it, so I'm not, I mean, I can see it's following the tragic loss of life.
Right. So were you a member of MTS at this time?
I believe so. I'm not even sure, honestly, if I still am or not.
Okay.
I think I am.
And if we scroll to the end of the first page, the paragraph beginning is in 2018. Yeah. It states that the submarine committee, were you a member of the submarine committee of MTS in 2018?
I believe so, yeah.
It says that the submarine committee never signed or sent this draft letter to OceanGate, and the draft letter was not approved or issued as a formal statement on behalf of MTS.
I was not aware of that. Wow.
Well, okay.
Yes, sir, I think you stated during testimony, you thought that it had been delivered.
I assumed it had
Or
been,
assumed.
yeah.
But on the record, it was not.
Oh, wow, incredible. Why was it not sent?
Sir, you don't have any knowledge of why it wasn't sent?
No, I don't. I assumed that it was, yeah.
No, for the record, no, it was not, and.
Incredible.
And that's noted. Commander Whalen?
Thank you, sir. Within the commercial submersible industry, what has been the most challenging part of working within the industry for yourself?
You know, in light of this tragic event, or just generally?
In light of this tragic event.
Well, certainly, one of the things that has happened, and I suppose it's not that surprising given the mythology that surrounds human-occupied vehicles. You know, go back to this notion that they're dangerous and they're scary and complicated and only crazy people dive in them. Well, the OceanGate tragedy served to reinforce that myth. And it is a myth because it's absolutely not true. You know, when I think about the certified and accredited vehicles that I've been playing around with for 40 plus years, and our track record of safety, which is unblemished for 50 years, that counts for something. And I think it's an important thing to bear in mind. The certification process works. We know it does. Our track record of safety proves it. And so, as far as I'm concerned, we need to insist on continued human exploration of the deep sea in certified and accredited machines, not experimental ones. There's no place for experimental machines in the deep sea, not when there's human beings. If you want to use an AUV or an ROV where you're not putting human lives at stake, that's one thing. But if you're putting people in them, I think we have to be held to that high bar of certification and accreditation from an internationally recognized third-party classification society. So,
Thank you, sir. That's all the questions I have.
Lieutenant Commander Williams?
Good afternoon, Mr. Lahey.
Good afternoon.
When testing the new pressure hulls or components of the submersibles for Triton, did you take any of those, or did any of those tests take the component or the pressure hull that you were testing to failure?
No. And I suppose that that shouldn't be a surprise, because the idea is that your calculations and analysis prove that the thing you're about to test is going to behave exactly as you've predicted. And if you had doubts about whether it could actually withstand the pressure testing, then we certainly wouldn't be doing the pressure testing.
You mentioned that Triton has utilized innovative systems that were outside of normal specifications allowed by industry standards or classification society rules. Can you give some examples of such novel designs?
Sure. So, for example, our full ocean depth sub, the Triton 36002 as we call it, and our numbering system isn't that creative, 36,000 feet / 2 people. It was a sub that nobody had ever certified a vehicle to dive to that depth. So if you looked in the rule book, under full ocean depth subs, the section was blank. So those rules had to be developed, and we developed them in concert with the classification societies, much like we developed the rules of operating a tourist submarine together with the United States Coast Guard in 1987. So we had ideas about what we thought was going to be necessary, and then we worked collaboratively with DNV to ensure that whatever testing we were doing, whatever unique features the craft was going to be fitted with, had the type of redundancies and backups and so on that they would insist upon. And so it was very much a collaboration with the certification agencies.
And approximately how long did that whole process take?
From the time we began the project to build the Triton 36002, we did approximately 10 months of preliminary design and engineering. Then we presented the client with our findings in terms of a preliminary design and budget and time frame. And then 2 years from the signing of that contract, we delivered the sub. Then we went out and realized there were a few things that we still needed to get right, brought it back in and did another few months of corrective stuff. Sometimes you take something out, things don't work exactly as well as you'd like, and so you address those and continue.
Has Triton utilized an acrylic pressure hull that was outside of the traditional shape allowed by PVHO or pressure vessels for human occupancy?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked that question, and yes, we have. We pioneered a new idea for an elliptical pressure boundary, which was something that had never been seen before. It was a brilliant idea by one of our principal designers, a guy named John Ramsey. It was a super clever idea, a way to get more people into a smaller volume while ensuring that they're still comfortable and they still have a great view. We then had to take, because that was an acrylic pressure boundary that had never been created before, the geometry fell outside of PVHO. DNV stipulated a series of additional testing requirements and so on, and some additional analysis that was needed to prove that the design, while novel, was still safe and still complied with their rules.
And to confirm, that did receive DNV certification?
Yes, it did. That's the sub I mentioned that's operating on the cruise ship, the cruise ship sub that carries 9 people, pilot and 8 guests. Dives to 200 meters, so the diving depth is less because it's not a spherical pressure boundary, it's an elliptical shape, and as such, it doesn't have the strength characteristics of a sphere.
We've heard through testimony that the forward dome got knocked off of the Titan and fell onto the ramp. In your experience, had a sub been classed, what would have been required if something like this happened to one of your subs prior to diving?
Well, first of all, it would have been an all-stop, and there would have to have been a report issued to the certification agencies to explain what had happened and to find out what had been the cause and what was done to ensure that it didn't happen again. But the idea of the front dome falling off is, well, it's ridiculous.
How long did it take for the submersible that dives to 11,000 meters get certified? How long did that take?
It was a 2-year, well, I guess a 3-year process, because they began with us during the initial phase, looking at our calculations and our analysis and our initial design assumptions, and it carried through to the time when I completed I guess the final step in the certification process is actually taking the vehicle with human beings in it to its maximum diving depth. We call it the final checkout dive. And I had the privilege of conducting that dive with the DNV surveyor, Jonathan Struve, a brilliant guy, incredibly smart engineer who was really a co-designer of that sub. That's how involved he was in the development of that vehicle. And we took that sub to 10,932 meters, which is about 35,865 feet. And we even salvaged a lander, pulled it out of the mud, and sent it to the surface as further demonstration that we hadn't just built a sub that is an elevator, takes you to the site, and can't actually do anything. We proved it could conduct meaningful work on the bottom, and that was a very important part. I wanted to build a sub that had utility, that could actually do work on the seafloor.
I think we need to take a break now, but we'll reconvene with more questions afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lahey. This session is now in recess, and we'll reconvene at 2:10.
Okay.
Okay, this hearing is now back in session. Before we continue with the line of questioning from Lieutenant Commander Williams, I'd like to make a clarification on the MTS letter that was discussed earlier. Lieutenant Steele, can you bring up Exhibit 96, please? I'm trying to find.
Go back up.
Okay. Want to clarify a point in this letter of how it was either delivered or what was given to OceanGate. So I'd like to just read the second paragraph here for the record. It says, in 2018, this group of volunteer members collaborated to draft a cohesive and directed message to OceanGate on best practices for the safe development and operation of new submersible technologies. The content of this draft letter has been widely shared by the media in recent days. The submarine committee never signed or sent this draft letter to OceanGate, and the draft letter was not approved or issued as a formal statement on behalf of the MTS or the committee. The letter was shared, though.
The letter draft, sorry, I'm
Sorry.
just reading.
Thank you. The letter draft was shared, though, with OceanGate by a committee member during the drafting process. OceanGate CEO Stockton Rush and the submarine committee chair engaged in discussions and agreed to disagree on the technical topics of the draft letter. It says of the letter, but I assume that was the draft. So that is the, are there any thoughts on that?
Well,
statement?
certainly that's probably what precipitated some of the exchanges that I did have with Stockton, where he knew I was not a fan of a vehicle being developed without the benefit of a class society involvement. And, I maintain that that is the most important takeaway from all of this, that we need to insist upon certification as a requirement of continued human occupied exploration of the deep sea.
So, Mr. Lahey, just to kind of clarify that point, around that time that the draft letter was shared with Mr. Rush, you then had direct discussions with him about the contents?
Sure. Well, I don't know if we talked directly about the letter, but we talked about, the idea of certification. I think I highlighted the fact that we had developed, the deepest diving sub in the world at the same time they were developing, this contraption. And frankly, there was absolutely no reason you couldn't certify. And, yes, there's additional cost, there's additional time and hassle associated with it, but the end result is you've got a piece of machinery that meets an internationally recognized set of standards and that people can use with confidence, knowing that an independent peer review of a third-party classification society has been conducted on it.
Sir, did you clarify during those discussions that the view was shared by the MTS and that there was a letter either being signed or drafted?
I honestly don't remember the specifics of the conversation, except to say that he knew I was a proponent of the certification process, and I knew he felt that it was a waste of time, and I think he described it as an impediment to innovation, which I staunchly disagree with.
Understand. OceanGate, are you satisfied that the record's complete now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Lahey.
Yep.
I'd like to continue with Lieutenant
Please.
Commander Williams.
You mentioned you train customers on how to operate your submersibles. In your professional opinion, can someone learn to pilot a sub in one day?
You might be able to make it go up and down and backwards and forwards, but that doesn't make you a pilot. It means you can try your hand at driving the sub. But to be a pilot, you need to understand what to do if something goes wrong, how to fix things when they break, how to diagnose faults. And that isn't something you can accomplish in a day, no.
When you were in the Bahamas, other than the glass spheres you mentioned, you stated you noticed several items that stood out to you, indicating they weren't ready for prime time. Can you expand on those other issues?
I just looked at the execution of some of the stuff, you know, the bolt that screws them into the hull, the fact that it didn't have lift points, you know, if something happened to that platform that it was on, how do you get the vehicle back on board? It just didn't seem to me that it had been particularly well thought out or executed. I saw evidence, you know, like where they were crimping cables, you know, to hold on weights, you know, it just looked amateurish in its execution. And so, you know, I kind of left that visit thinking, well, you know, that's a relief. I don't think that'll ever take people on any significant dives. And obviously I underestimated their tenacity.
Mr. Lahey, just to frame this discussion, that was the prototype Titan hull, not the same hull that was used in the...
I don't know which one it was. I just know it was March of 2019. So
Yes, sir.
whatever it was, that's
But
what I saw.
I just want to clarify for the record, we know that that was the prototype hull that was not used during
Okay.
2021, 2022.
So they may have made wholesale improvements since that time. I don't know. I didn't sort of stick with it, but I just gave them what I thought were some helpful suggestions of things they could improve to make the vehicle safer and better. But of course, I could never comment on the efficacy of the design. I mean, that's really up to the engineers that designed it. And, you know, I'm not an engineer.
For Triton Submarines, to clarify, does Triton only build subs and sell them to customers, or does Triton operate other submersibles? Or any of the ones that are constructed?
We're not an operator. We design, engineer, build, and then deliver subs. We will sometimes operate a sub for a client, but we're not in the submarine operations business. Having said that, you know, my team spent 9 months in Vietnam training the crew to operate, you know, their 24-passenger tourist submarine, because until we were satisfied that they could operate and maintain that submarine appropriately and in accordance with our rules and the class society rules, then, you know, we weren't ready to leave. So we're very committed to the subs we deliver and to their continued safe use.
Approximately how many submersibles have been constructed by Triton subs?
I believe the number is 30, and with about 4 or 5 in construction right now. So not a huge number, but it, you know, a very respectable number.
I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this question, but approximately how many dives have been conducted by Triton subs?
Well, many thousands of dives. I actually was on a client's vessel last year, and one of the subs they had was completing its 1,000th dive. This is a sub that's rated to 1,000 meters. So how many of them, I don't have the specific numbers, but you know, the customers of ours that are using their subs a lot, I'm sure have done many thousands of dives. And so collectively, I'm sure it's a rather significant number.
Has there ever been a catastrophic loss of the Triton submersibles?
No, there has not.
Are you aware of any incidents on a Triton sub where there was loss of life?
No, absolutely not. Of course not. No.
And earlier you mentioned that the submersible community has had an unblemished history for the last 50 years. Are you aware of when the last loss of life on a submersible was prior to OceanGate's
Yes, I
accident?
am. I'm very familiar with it. It was a sub that was actually ensnared in a net off the coast of Florida. It's one of the subs that belonged to the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution. And the JSLs, of which there are two of them, one of them became ensnared in a net. And the two people in the DLO, the diver lockout compartment, perished when their carbon dioxide level reached a level that they could no longer sustain, and combination of hypothermia and carbon dioxide poisoning killed them. The two people in the acrylic sphere in the front were fine because they didn't have those same challenges. When you're in a metallic boundary and the hull cools to ambient temperature, even in a place like Florida, the temperature was low enough that their soda lime, or the carbon dioxide absorbent that they were using, was no longer effectively removing the CO2.
And what year did that occur?
I believe it was 1974 or 73.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Mr. Lahey, I just have some follow-up questions from the earlier lines.
Please.
For the initial Atlantis submersible certifications that you mentioned, I believe you said it was in the 70s. Is that correct?
No, that was 1987.
1987.
The first Atlantis sub operating in U.S. waters was on the island of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and it was 1987.
And you said that was an initial certification with really no federal regulations to oversee that or provide requirements for that.
Right. We had, of course, a classed sub. The sub was ABS certified, but the Coast Guard rules had not yet been developed. So, everybody sort of scrambled, and we put our heads together and thought about what we needed to do to ensure a safe operation. Procedures were developed. The crew were trained, and tests were administered actually in Puerto Rico, I believe it was, where we completed our written tests and so on.
Were Coast Guard Marine inspectors involved in that process?
Yes, they were.
How long did that process take, approximately?
Might have been 4 to 6 months. But there was work that was happening before the vehicle arrived, and I'm sure there was plenty of work done afterward, because the NAVIC wasn't actually published until 93, I guess. So 6 years later.
Yes, sir, NAVIC 593.
593, yeah. Because I think that's the date, right? I picked up on that.
Sir, when you design a submarine, do you also design the launching systems?
Well, I don't personally design the subs, but we have some very clever people that work at Triton that do that. And when we're asked to get involved in launch and recovery systems, we certainly do. And we often will work with a client or with the client's chosen crane, A-frame manufacturing company to ensure that the launch and recovery systems are compatible with the sub. The features on the vessel for securing the deck to the ship have been addressed. Things like how you're going to tow the sub and all that sort of stuff is part of what we do. We call that part of the delivery process integration. And we want to make sure that that goes smoothly, and that whatever launch and recovery system has been specified is appropriate in terms of its loading limits and so on for safely launching and recovering the sub.
If it's a crane system, is that typically like straps, or do you have lifting points?
We have lifting points, but sometimes there are straps involved. But again, those straps would be rated and certified and tested.
And when you sell a submersible, do you put a contract or agreement in place with the purchaser that ensures that they will keep the submarine classed?
Yes, that's a requirement that they are, that's something they're required to comply with to maintain certification. And of course, we're kept abreast of every one of our subs' status with the certification agencies. We have somebody in our office whose sole job is classification society related issues. And if a sub is about to fall out of class, or has fallen out of class, or has been laid up, or whatever, we're aware of it, and then we interface with the client to help them address whatever might account for why it hasn't been put back into service or put back into class.
Have there been occasions where submarines have fallen out of class?
Not fallen out of class. What they'll sometimes do is they'll put them in what they describe as laid up status. So if a sub isn't going to be used for a prolonged period, rather than using up the clock, if you will, your certification clock, they'll lay it up, and then they'll do what's called a reactivation survey when they're ready to put it back into service. But no, as I said before, every sub that Triton has built in our 17-year history remains in class, certified to its original depth, and in the hands of a client that we have a great relationship with.
What would happen if a submarine went out of class and kept operating?
Well, that would be a problem because I think our customers uniformly recognize and agree with the importance of certification. So any more than they would allow their ships to lapse, because they're all classed as well, by the way. So in many cases, the ships are classed by the same organizations that class the subs. And the people that class the vessel would certainly not permit them to let a sub be on board a vessel if it wasn't classed. And if anybody were using a sub that was not classed, then that would, I don't believe, I can't think of an example of when that's ever happened, so.
Do you know if your submersibles are registered or flagged?
Some of them are. Not all of our customers choose to flag their subs, but some of them do. And as I mentioned before, oftentimes they're flagged in the Cayman Islands, and believe it or not, as obscure as this may seem, the Cayman Islands actually has rules governing the safe operation and maintenance and continued operations of a human-occupied vehicle, of a submersible.
The submarines that are not registered or flagged, would those be recreational use?
I don't know that it's a requirement for a sub to have flag status that's being used to carry passengers. I'm just trying to think. If the sub in Vietnam or the one on the cruise ship, if they have a flag status, I'd probably have to ask our classification society expert. I don't actually know. But I don't think it would change anything, because fundamentally, whether it has a flag state affiliation or not, the certification would still be the primary reason that, it's safe.
Certification by a third party.
That's right. Independent third-party certification by, it can be a variety of them, but ours typically are always, ours are all either ABS or DNV.
Out of curiosity, you mentioned earlier about a submersible having power systems that were limited, like batteries. Did you mention what type of power systems a submarine would then have?
I don't know if I touched on it, but happy to do so. Vast majority of submersibles are powered by batteries. There's a whole range of different battery chemistries, as I'm sure you know, particularly today with the onslaught of batteries that are being developed for electric vehicles. So we're fortunate in that those developments in battery technology have made their way to our vehicles and have enhanced their performance immeasurably. So whereas a sub powered by traditional battery technology, lead acid, for example, might have had a 6-hour operational endurance with the new battery chemistry, you might easily double that endurance and eliminate the dangers associated with hydrogen gas evolution, the need to ventilate, the need to do maintenance. Life expectancies are increased, charging rates are faster. So it's the definition of a transformative technology. But yes, the vast majority of them are battery powered. I know that fuel cells is another area that is being looked into, and there have been examples of some that are fuel cell powered. And we've even built some that have diesel engines, so they get a little push from that.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
At this time, I'd like to go to the NTSB for any questions.
Good afternoon again, sir.
Good afternoon.
Earlier, we talked about emergency response, and you mentioned coordination. And is that a service that Triton provides?
When we're asked to, we absolutely will assist a customer with that. But we provide them with the templates that they need to create their own self-help and outside help plans. So they don't have to rely on us if they're in a remote part of the world and they would like us to assist them in identifying local and regional assets that could help them in an emergency, then we will. But in many cases, they can do that research on their own. Quite often, though, we will get consulted because we, having been in this business a long time, we have contacts in many places in the world, and giving them the names of a local ROV company or another sub that's in the area, they will sometimes reach out to us.
Other than the Navy or other navies, is there one company out there that's tracking where all the Mercy assets are at?
I've heard that, I know that Ismerlo, which is a military submarine kind of group, I think, we certainly stay in touch with all of our customers, but as far as other operators, because we're not the only manufacturers out there, so there are other people who've manufactured subs. And certainly, I do know of some examples where there's groups that have been set up, like, where you communicate by instant message and chatting and so on. So if there's a group of people diving in the Bahamas, they'll introduce a new operator, and then the other operators who typically operate in that same area will say, welcome to the area, we're over here, we're over there, and if you need our help, let us know, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But it's not a formal process.
Regarding flagging, you mentioned Cayman Islands, Vietnam. Are there other nations that require that you have subs flagged with?
Well, yeah, U.S., yeah, sure. Yeah,
There are U.S.
flag.
flag manned submersibles.
Well, I'm thinking of the Atlanta subs. They would be U.S. flag, I'm sure. But the ones because we actually had to build them in the United States because of the Jones Act, we couldn't build. It's a Canadian company, Atlantis. So the subs would be built in Canada if they were going to other places other than the United States. But when a sub goes to Hawaii or a U.S. destination like U.S. Virgin Islands or Guam, they have to be flagged U.S., and therefore the subs have to actually be built in the United States.
Are there U.S. flagged Triton submersibles?
I'm just trying to think if any of our U.S. customers flag them. I just don't think that many of our customers bother with flagging them. The vessels that they're aboard are flagged, certainly, but the sub is sort of almost considered to be a tender to the vessel and doesn't necessarily have a flag affiliation. So I think Marshall Islands is one that I've seen. I know that Norway, we have a client that has a Norwegian flag, Spanish. I'm sure that some of our U.S. clients probably flag their subs, but I don't actually know. Again, I'd probably have to consult with our classification society expert about that.
Okay, since you brought up tenders, there's ships out there where the tenders themselves have their own SOLAS passenger safety certificate. Would be similar, I would think, if you're carrying passengers?
I imagine it would be. If you're carrying passengers for hire and it's, a sub that is being used and, for tourism, I imagine. So, yes.
Are you
But
aware
it's
of
on a
any-
private vessel. I think that perhaps the requirements may not be the same. I don't know, actually.
Are there any manned submersibles where the flag does not match the surface tender or the surface ship?
It's a good question. I don't think so. I think you'd want the two to match. I do know there were examples of a Cayman-flagged vessel where they had a sub that couldn't meet the Cayman Islands flag registry requirements, and they had to get rid of their sub. But our subs all comply with the Cayman Islands shipping registry rules for submarines.
We talked a little bit about launch and recovery earlier. Is that process part of the classification as well?
It certainly would be. The classification society is going to want to make sure that the appliance that's used to launch and recover the sub, meets their requirements.
Would it be fair to say that manned submersibles are going to be ubiquitous within a generation?
I certainly hope so.
So given that, are there opportunities for improvement in either class standard or class rules or flag state regulations?
Well, the class rules are constantly evolving, as most things are. So if you were to look at the rules from when I started my career nearly 40 years ago, and you look at the rules today, a lot of things have changed because technology's advanced. We're using systems and components that didn't exist. Our lighting systems, our battery systems, our propulsion systems, methods of communication, navigation, all of it has improved. And with it, the rules have to keep up. So the rules are constantly being updated to reflect, the current technologies. Another thing that's happened, and again, I'm not a designer, I'm not an engineer, but I do know that the software tools that engineers have access to, their capacity to analyze complex structures and to perform finite element analysis, all of those things have dramatically improved. So our capacity to produce better and better vehicles, of course, has improved along with that, with those software developments. And as well, the certification agencies themselves are more receptive to looking at things perhaps differently than they would have in the old days when different types of testing might be required, whereas now there's this idea of design by analysis. Doesn't mean you don't do testing, it just means that design by analysis has gotten some traction because it's so effective. It's such an effective way for you to analyze a complex structure.
All right, so speaking of analyzing complex systems, in addition to FEAs, have you ever done an FMEA?
Yes, we do those routinely with our vehicles.
And for the record, that would be a
Failure modes and effects
Effects
analysis.
analysis.
In fact, we just had to do one for a client that's picking up their sub right now. So they wanted one done. We have one done for each model. And I think they had some specific operational things that they wanted us to address in our FMEA.
Do any of the classification societies require that?
Again, probably something I need to check with my classification society expert. I'm not trying to be evasive. I just don't know the answer. I think, yes, we would, I think, typically supply the classification society with an FMEA.
Okay.
Yeah,
So we've heard you say you're a fan of class societies.
I am.
So other than marketing and insurance, what requires you to be classified?
Common sense, I suppose, a desire to ensure that the equipment we're building meets an internationally recognized set of standards and that people can dive in our machines with confidence and in absolute safety. As I said, you go back to the track record of safety, which is unprecedented. I can't think of any other mode of transportation that can boast a 50-year track record of perfect safety. And I think there's no doubt that the certification process does work. It's tremendously effective. And I think it's effective because of how comprehensive it is in scope. And that because it stays with the vehicle throughout its lifetime, it's a great way to ensure that the continued use of a human-occupied vehicle is going to be something that a person can do and can use with confidence.
Okay, so lastly, if there's no requirement to be classed, there's no requirement to be flagged, there's no requirement for the sub to match the surface tender's flag, how can we prevent what happened with Titan?
I think insisting on certification, and you say that there's no requirement for it, that's my point. There should be a requirement for it. I believe that continued human exploration of the deep sea requires certification, that we should not be operating experimental vehicles. I'm not a fan of the idea of an experimental airplane. If somebody can throw together an airplane in their garage and take it out flying, and there's plenty of people that do that. I personally would not get in one. I personally believe that having an independent peer review of your design engineering assumptions is a critical part of ensuring that the thing you do eventually manufacture and deliver meets an internationally recognized set of standards.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Lahey.
Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to go to OceanGate for any questions.
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Fawcett, I believe you have a question.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Keith Fawcett.
Good afternoon, Keith.
I just want to follow up on a question that Commander Williams asked. So this was, she asked a question about a class submersible where the dome falls off after a dive, and you, I believe you stated, correct me if I'm wrong, that if it was classed, it would require a report to class.
That's correct. Any incident involving a sub, a class sub, has to be reported. So whatever that incident, if somebody has a slip and fall, if you have a component failure, whatever, there's so many incidents, I can't think of, a specific one, but we have to report it. And then what was done to correct it also has to be reported. And that includes, like, if a submarine is damaged in shipping, we can't just begin using it. They have to do an inspection, and then they generate a report based on their findings. And if there are things that have to be repaired, those items are repaired. And if there's things that have to be tested after that repair, they have to be tested. And only after it's been given the clean bill of health are you allowed to continue using it.
So in that particular case, if you made a report to class, would it be fair to say that class may require a corrective action on the part of the owner of the vessel?
I would venture to guess that it's a certainty. They would insist that the failure that occurred would have to be corrected. There'd have to be an explanation for why it happened and what's been done to ensure that it can't happen again.
And might it include a class surveyor attending the site and attending the vessel to make sure, to the satisfaction of the surveyor, that those corrective actions had taken place?
It would absolutely include that.
Thank you, sir. That's all I have, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Fawcett. Mr. Lahey, I think you mentioned earlier for your acrylic
Yes.
submarines that you used the design basis analysis is that correct?
In some of them, yes.
Was that because it was a new hull material?
Yes, that's right. It was designed by analysis, I think the term that's used.
Did you find that process to be lengthy, or was it, how long did that take for a standard
Well, I didn't
new design?
personally conduct that process, but our engineers did. And it didn't it didn't change the delivery schedule of the vehicle. So I would say that it didn't, hinder our capacity to complete the vehicle on a timeline and according to a schedule that we'd committed to.
Thank you. For the record, the Coast Guard does have a process for a design basis analysis from our Marine Safety Center. I just want to put that on the record. Sir, at this time, are there any final questions for Mr. Lahey? Oh, I'm sorry, Commander Whalen?
You had mentioned a few times with regards to the classification societies and having a classed vessel is not a requirement, but more of a recommendation. It's a requirement for, you said, what other nation was that? I apologize.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
The Cayman Islands.
Yes,
Cayman Islands requires a classification society.
They do. Well, the flag state, they have very specific rules about the operating and safe operating, maintenance, and piloting of a sub, and that's because the first real sort of tourist subs actually arrived in the Cayman Islands ahead of when we first deployed subs in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so, not surprisingly, when the people in the Cayman Islands, saw that there was equipment out there taking people underwater, they decided they wanted to develop some rules for how those subs would be safely operated and maintained. I think they largely came out of here's another acronym for you, AODC, Association of Offshore Diving Contractors, which is the world I came from, oil and gas. A lot of those rules were developed in the oil and gas industry in the 70s and the 80s.
Are you aware of any International Maritime Organization or IMO requirements to be for submersibles?
I'm sure there are some IMO requirements, but I'd probably have to defer our classification society expert on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any further questions for Mr. Lahey? Mr. Lahey, is there anything the board has not asked you that you think would be valuable for this investigation?
Not that I can think of, except I would like to say that aside from the tragic loss of life, which was both regrettable and unfortunate, the fact that that machine killed 5 people and created such a frenzy throughout the world about human-occupied vehicles had a sort of an unexpected consequence, and that is that legitimate operators of subs who go through this very arduous, time-consuming, expensive, and necessarily thorough accreditation process were sort of grouped in with that. And I think I appreciated having an opportunity to participate in this hearing so I could share with you the stark difference between the beautifully designed and thoughtfully engineered machines created by those of us who do value the accreditation and certification process and those who tend to focus on experimental vehicles. I think as long as we insist on certification as a requirement for continued human-occupied exploration of the deep sea, we can avoid these kind of tragic outcomes. And I'll finish by just saying that I believe that submersibles are the most magical machines on the planet. They transport human beings to what I consider to be the most beautiful part of our world, which is in the deep sea. And they do it with absolute safety. And I think we don't want to discourage people diving in subs. What we do is we want to educate people as to the difference between an experimental sub and a certified sub, which, as I mentioned, has this incredible track record of safety to substantiate that they are machines that we don't need to be afraid of. And I do hope that as a result of this inquiry and the eventual acceptance of certification as an important requirement for continued use of a sub, that more people get to have the privilege of seeing the ocean from the perspective that I've had the privilege of seeing it. Because if you want to create advocacy, if you want to create passion and love of the ocean, put a person in a human-occupied vehicle, and you'll have an advocate for life. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lahey, you are now released as a witness at this formal hearing. Thank you for your testimony and cooperation. If I later determine that this board needs additional information from you, I will contact you directly. If you have any questions about this investigation, you may contact the investigation recorder, Lieutenant Steele. She was at the podium. At this time, the hearing will recess and reconvene at 1500.
Thank you.